Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Crumbley. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'll be your narrator through this presentation on guilt. This module is one of 5 modules that have been developed for a course entitled Engaging Relative Caregivers, an Overview of Kinship Care, Managing Risk Factors in Kinship Care. What you're about to see is a clip of me doing training with professionals addressing 3 issues in kinship care. The first issue will be looking at what are the cues and sources of guilt experienced by relative caregivers. I'll then be looking at what are the goals, approaches, and scripts that you can use with relative caregivers in helping them manage their guilt. The third question and topic will be looking at what are the differences in feelings and the impact of guilt between kinship caregivers compared to non-relative foster parents and adoptive parents. I have 2 questions for you viewing this video. The first question is, how does guilt impact a relative caregiver's ability to provide permanency, safety, and well-being for the children in their care? And the second question I'd like you, the viewing audience, to ask is, what are the goals, approaches, and scripts that would be useful in your practice with relative caregivers? So please sit back, relax. I'll join you after the conclusion of the videotape, and then we'll summarize the training. Okay, thank you. Guilt. One of the questions that all of us have to ask when we're placing children in kinship care, and in fact even makes us afraid to place children in kinship care, is, will the relative be able to place the needs of the children over who? The birth parents. Gotcha. Now let's talk about why that's an issue, why that's a concern. All right, go back to your courses on attachment and bonding. And here's my question. A relative caregiver's initial experiences of attachment and bonding is with whom first? The child in their care or the child's birth parent? Okay, I'll ask it again. A relative caregiver's initial experiences of bonding and attachment, even if it's dysfunctional, even if it's negative, even if it's hostile, is with whom first? Oh, y'all already know. Right, it's with the birth parents. A foster parent's initial experiences of bonding and attachment is with who first? I didn't even have to finish the question. Right, it's with the child. So, for the relative caregiver whose initial attachment is with that birth parent, they're vulnerable to these kinds of questions and comments from birth parents. I know that there's a restraining order, and I know I can't come in, but how can you not let me in? I'm your what? Child. I know that my baby needs a place to stay, but come on, you knew who first? Me. How can you believe that social worker over me? How can you believe, I don't care what that report says, I'm your what? Or son, or daughter, or sister, brother. All right, how about this one? Yeah, I know I have to stop using drugs, and I know I've got a drug problem, but come on, why are you coming down hard on me? Don't you know I smoked my first joint with who? Yeah. How about this one? Okay, all right. I know I'm coming to these visits high, and my eyes are all glassy, and I'm always late, but come on, we're what? Yeah. Now, can you see them talking to a foster parent like that? Imagine coming to a foster parent's home and saying, listen, I need a place to stay. I'd like to just stay for a few hours. Can you see the foster parent? Yeah, you just stay right there. Hold on, 911. And then the next person they'll be calling is a social worker saying, look, I'm putting in my 7-day notice right now. Come and get this child. I guess my whole point is that there's certain vulnerabilities that come from that bonding and attachment that relatives have with those birth parents that foster parents don't have. Another source of guilt for relative caregivers is being more successful with the child than guess who? The birth parent. You got to remember, a relative caregiver's success makes who look bad? The birth parent. Yeah, so that can be a source of guilt. Even if they don't like the birth parent, the fact is they can still feel guilty because they know who they're making look bad. Another source of guilt is the child developing a greater affinity, more of an attachment with that relative caregiver than with the birth parent. One of the biggest trigger for many relative caregivers is when that child starts calling them what? And it gets those birth parents so angry, and those relative caregivers are feeling guilty because, again, the children are more attached to them than to their own parents. Being a better parent to the child than they were to the birth parent. Can you see that being a source of guilt? See, that's what makes kinship care work, though. That's why kinship care works. Relative caregivers are better the second time around. That's why it works. But for a relative caregiver to admit that I'm better the second time around means that maybe they weren't too good when the first time around. And that's the guilt. That's the embarrassment. That's the dichotomy. You know, it's a two-edged sword. Now, there are cues that you should be looking for that will let you know if that relative caregiver is experiencing guilt. And 15, 20 years ago, we didn't even hear the cues. They were just going right over our heads because we were so used to working with foster parents. But now we're much more aware, and I think you have to listen for those cues. And those cues can sound like this. Is what's happening to my son or daughter because of me and how I raised them? Another statement might be, I can't blame that daughter or my son not wanting that child to live with me. Look at what I did to who? Them. Another source of guilt could be, another statement that you want to listen for is taking the child away from the relative caregiver going to come between me and the birth parent? You see the problem there? You know, they're already feeling the stress, there's already the tension, and now there's another wedge. Another source of guilt is, did my mistakes, and this is one I think really makes a lot of relative caregivers guilty, did my mistakes as a parent cause my child to turn out the way they are now? You know, was it my drugs and use of alcohol, or was it because of my incarceration, or was it because of my substance abuse, or was it because I got pregnant too early, or was it because I was partying too much? Those are the triggers. You know, so what may have caused that? Another source of guilt is, and I love this one, that he blames me for taking the child, and he's blaming me and actually believes that I think that he can't take care of the child. So that can be another source in terms of what you want to listen for. Now, I guess my point is, if you don't hear these statements, please use your assessments to determine if they're having these kinds of feelings. This is where assessment becomes real crucial. You need to have conversations with relative caregivers that are going to let you know if they feel it's their fault, or if they feel as they're responsible, or if they feel as though they've contributed to it. See, we didn't ask these kind of questions of foster parents, but with relative caregivers, you need to know. So use your interviewing skills to assess whether or not that's going on. So, what are your goals? Well, this may sound strange, but first of all, they've got to learn how to live with the guilt. The guilt does not go away. So for relative caregivers, it's how do you live with the guilt? You know, how do you accept what's happened in the past so that you can move on? Our second goal is getting relative caregivers to forgive themselves. Forgiving themselves is crucial. They cannot wait for the birth parents to forgive them. You can't even wait for your own children to forgive you. In their 20s, they're blaming you for everything. In their 30s, they're making mistakes. By the time they hit 40, they're starting to realize, well, maybe I'm in my situation because of things that I did. But by 40, you're 60 years old. So look how long you've been waiting to be forgiven. So for relative caregivers, they have to learn to start forgiving themselves and can't wait for the birth parents to forgive them. Your third goal, and this gets real kind of clinical, but I think it kind of makes sense. Relative caregivers need to find out what those guilt triggers are. Because that guilt trigger could be you were incarcerated. Or that guilt trigger might be that you were too young when you had the children. Or it might be having used substance abuse. Or it might even have been being an abuser yourself. So what are those guilt triggers? And then what's the response that they need to have? What's that repertoire of responses that they need to have to manage the guilt that's triggered? And when I say the repertoire to manage the guilt, I'm talking about coming up with ideas and being able to protect themselves from being manipulated and victimized by who? The birth parents. That's what I'm talking about. So they need to find out what that trigger is, come up with that response so that they can't be manipulated, protect themselves from being manipulated so they can protect who? Thank you. Okay? So those are our goals. So how do you do all this? All right. First thing is getting the relative caregiver to kind of accept and live with the guilt. When you start hearing relative caregivers say things like, it's my fault, maybe it's because of what I did, that the child is not able to take care of their own, maybe they are the way because of my incarceration, because of my substance abuse, they haven't learned how to accept what happened yet. They're not living with the guilt yet. Those are the cues. So they may need to hear you say things like, okay, maybe it is your fault that they turned out the way they did. Or maybe you are partially to blame for that birth parent having the problems that they have. And yeah, maybe you are partially to blame for their not being able to follow through and being the kind of parents that they should be. But guess what? You admitted it. You're not trying to defend it. You're not trying to deny it. You're not making excuses for it. You admitted it. You did what you need to do as far as making amends. You've done what you can do as far as making restitution for what you did. And if you've done those things, you can move on. What we have to get relative caregivers to do and ask of themselves is, are there any more apologies I could possibly make that are going to change things? Is there any more restitution I can make that's going to change what happened in the past? Are there any more explanations I can give that's going to change what happened in the past? And if the answers to those questions are no, then that means you've earned the right to move on. And moving on means being able to use what you've learned in the past so you can do things differently now and in the future. That's the barometer, and that means you can move on. When you start hearing relative caregivers say, oh, I'm an awful person, and I'm a terrible person, and when you know they're vulnerable to being accused of being a terrible person by the birth parent, they've got to learn how to validate themselves and appreciate their growth. So they're going to need to hear you say things like, okay, yeah, well, maybe you were a substance abuser in the past. Yeah, maybe you made some terrible mistakes in the past. Maybe, yeah, you went to jail and did some awful things. But guess what? You're not the person now that you were then. They need to hear us say that to them. And then you've got to give them justification to validate the fact that they're different. You know you're not the person now that you were then because you've been through rehab. You know you're not the person now that you were then because you did your time. You went to prison. You know you're not the person now that you were then because you've been in therapy and you're involved with the support groups. That's what validates the fact that you have done things differently and that you're not the same person now that you were then. Sometimes you're going to run into relative caregivers who feel as though they can't forgive themselves. And you're going to hear them saying things like, oh, how can I forgive myself? Or they won't let me forget what I did in the past. There doesn't seem to be enough that I could do to make that birth parent forgive me. They're going to have to learn to forgive themselves, so they're going to need to hear you say things like, okay, all right, you did those things, and what that birth parent is saying did happen, but guess what? You've earned the right to forgive yourself because you're now taking care of who? That child. You've earned the right to forgive yourself because you're now giving that birth parent an opportunity to get themselves together. You've earned the right to forgive yourself because you're now being the parent now that you weren't then. You're sacrificing, you're modeling, you're taking care of that child. You're not the same person, and you've earned the right to forgive yourself. Sometimes you're going to run into relative caregivers who are going to have problems when they hear that child starting to call them mom. And they're going to see that child more closer to them and more attached. I remember when we used to go up on the bus trips, Brenda, remember when you go up on the bus trips to Muncie Prison? Every mother, every relative caregiver would have this little mini meeting with the children. And you'd hear them say, now look, we're going to visit your mom. When we go into the prisons, please don't call me what? Mom, okay? So if you find that and you see that happening with relative caregivers, they're going to need to hear you say things like, well, okay, I know you don't want to replace that birth parent, but we got an IEP meeting next week. If you're not there, then who's going to be there? And that child has a play next week, and all the other parents are going to be there. Who's going to be there for your child if you're not there? And your daughter's prom is coming up, and all the parents are going to be there at those meetings. Who's going to be there for that child if you're not there? And the child has to go into kindergarten in September. So they're going to need to learn those ABCs. Who's going to teach them now if you're not there? We're talking about having what I call if not, then what conversations. These are conversations of, if not you, then who conversations. Because that helps relative caregivers live with the guilt. So when we start hearing relative caregivers feel as though that they shouldn't make those attachments, give them the reality. Yeah, mom might be home in 3 weeks, but the reality is somebody has to be there for that child. If not you, then who? When we talk about helping relative caregivers identify those triggers, when we talk about getting relative caregivers to develop that repertoire, I think it's important that you understand that these scripts that I have listed here, they're really not just for you. These scripts are also for the relative caregivers. This dialogue becomes a monologue for the relative caregiver in terms of being able to know what to say when that guilt gets triggered. And when they know what to say, they're also developing safety planning for relative caregivers. Having those scripts of knowing how to deal with the guilt is safety planning for relative caregivers. Because relative caregivers, in order to protect the child, they have to be able to protect who? Thank you. So I know that's a strange concept because we do safety planning for the children. No, this repertoire, these responses are for relative caregivers, because in order for relative caregivers to care for the children, it starts with caring for themselves. They need to come up with those repertoires. Those dialogues become their monologues that they have with themselves so they can protect themselves from being victimized and manipulated, so that they can protect the child from being victimized and manipulated. And the nice thing about it is, if the children see the relative caregivers able to protect themselves, the relatives are also modeling for the children how to do what? Protect and care for themselves. Okay, on that note, and on that ring, I'd like to thank Annie E. Casey for allowing me this opportunity to present. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come out today and be part of this training. And I hope this material is useful for you in your practice. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the video. What I'd like to do now is summarize the training and summarize this module. And I'd like to do that by first looking at what are some of the sources of guilt experienced by relative caregivers. As you heard in the video, there was a variety of sources. If you had to remember anything, to me the most important source of guilt is when you have to place the needs of the child over that of the birth parent. Other sources of guilt is being successful, that relative caregivers, where their success makes the birth parent look bad. Another source of guilt is the child being more attached to the relative caregiver than to the birth parent. Another source of guilt is the relative caregiver being a better parent to the child in their care than they were to the birth parent. And I'm even going to extend it past just grandparents. Sometimes we know relative caregivers are aunts and uncles, sisters and brothers. So they can feel guilty too, for the same reasons, putting those needs before the sibling, making the sibling look bad because they're successful, the child being more attached to the sibling than to the birth parent, and then being a better caregiver to the child than they were to their own brothers and sisters. So I think we want to look past just grandparents and look at how this is affecting siblings as well. Cues, if you're hearing things like, is it my fault? Is it something I should have done differently? Are they having problems because of what I did? Goals and approaches. I think we have to start very quickly. Of all the goals that I mentioned, I think the most important one has to do with helping the relative caregiver identify those guilt triggers, and then developing those responses, using those scripts that you have and making sure those scripts becomes the monologues with relative caregivers so that they can protect themselves from being manipulated and victimized. I think when we start looking at differences and implications for practice, the implications start with number one, our assessments. Our assessments need to look different. We need to use our assessments to identify what those guilt triggers are for relative caregivers. Our training and preparation needs to look different. They need to understand how guilt can trigger and make them vulnerable to being victimized, and how protecting themselves is essential in order to protect the child. I think our individual work with relative caregivers need to be around what are those triggers specific to them? Is it going to be drugs and alcohol? Is it going to be abuse and neglect? Is the trigger going to be having been incarcerated? What are those triggers that make them vulnerable? And then I think the other thing we have to do is realizing that we have to do safety planning with relative caregivers. Get them to know how to protect themselves in order for them to protect the child. So thank you so much for taking time to view this. I hope this is useful in your practice, and take care.